All right, the United States finds itself in a place where we're attempting to support Ukraine and perform this proxy war against Vladimir Putin and Russia. We've got Israel dealing with Hamas and the Gaza invasion. We've also got China watching all of this, waiting to make moves on a global scale. I have a show favorite with me today, Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Thank you, Colonel Macgregor, for joining us again.
Sure.
So yesterday, an airplane with Israeli citizens arrived in Russia. The tarmac was infiltrated and swarmed with what I can only describe as Arab immigrants within Russia, chanting Allah Akbar as they admitted that they were there to hunt down and kill Jews. Russia's airport police and regular police had to make arrests and get the group under control. What are your thoughts on stories like this? Is this a Hamas group within Russia or just an anti-Israel group? And are you worried about how many Arabs have been driven out of the Middle East into Europe that could wake up and suddenly make attacks on the very towns that they are now residing in?
Well, let's start with the first part of this. The story that you just recited is false.
Okay.
The Russians told me, and I contacted my Russian sources, that plane did not have any Israelis on it. In fact, the only person that got off that anybody looked at strangely was an Uzbek. And what you had was not an Arab group by any means at all. These are simply Turkic people who live in Dagestan.
Okay.
Americans know nothing about the region as usual. And you have various different types, Dagestanis, Chechens. There are a whole range of tribes that have become nations over the years. They are Turks or Turkic, depending upon which definition you want to use. Everybody effectively between the border with Mongolia's border with Kazakhstan all the way to Turkey speaks effectively the same language. And we call those people Tatars, Turkic, any number of different things. The one exception, of course, are the Tajiks. They speak a version of Persian. In other words, indistinguishable from modern Farsi. But everybody else speaks Turkic. That means that the people living in the Caucasus and Central Asia can all read and listen to Mr. Erdogan. Mm-hmm. That's very important because Mr. Erdogan sees himself as the de facto leader of Sunni Islam and also prides himself on being the leading voice for Turkic or Turkish people and culture in the world. This is one of the reasons that the Russians have managed the 40 million or so Muslim Turks and Tartars in their country very carefully. Russia normally has no difficulty whatsoever with this. But I suspect that they've been listening to Mr. Erdogan, and they went there enraged at what is happening in Gaza, and they're not unique. And I would not confuse the rage at what the Israelis are doing in Gaza with anti-Semitism. It's in the interest of Israelis to brand everything as anti-Semitism, but there are many places in the world where Jews are completely safe, and I would include most of Central Asia in that category. No one objects to Jews, but there are lots of objections to things the Israelis do. So that's another distinction that we don't bother to make in the press. And if you turn on the mainstream, nobody keeps you informed about anything.
Yeah. Okay. So you think that was a false, like, feeder story through Western media?
I doubt it. I think it's just that these people have been following things through Russian media as well as Turkish media. As I said, if you listen to Mr. Erdogan's speeches, they're very, very inflammatory. They're very nationalistic, but nationalistic in a way that we would regard as internationalist, because he's speaking not just to 90 million Turks in Anatolia. He's speaking to another 100 million plus in Central Asia. And we need to understand that. Mr. Putin does, and that's why he manages his relations with Mr. Erdogan very carefully.
Yeah. Well, I know many felt that Erdogan had betrayed his NATO roots in order to reestablish a pipeline from Russia through Turkey, because Turkey's lira was collapsing due to inflation. I think it had lost 80% of its value. And so they're just trying to get their society and their country back up and running. Of course, the Western media is saying Erdogan has betrayed NATO. We should, stop all military weapon sales to Turkey. But he's playing two different worlds, it seems.
NATO is a paper alliance. Let's not impute too much significance to it. It has too many members. It's totally ineffective and dysfunctional. The reason that Turkey was in NATO was because Greece was in NATO. And this was our effort after the Second World War to stop the outbreak of future wars in the Eastern Mediterranean. So we thought if we brought the Greeks and the Turks in, that would make it difficult for them to do that. The other reason was the Turks were always anti-communist. Kemal Ataturk was very anti-communist. And he was actually very pro-German and pro-Italian. In other words, we would say pro-fascist or pro-Nazi. But he was always an anti-communist. And so we had good relations with the Turks. If Hitler had managed his own defunct grand strategy a little bit better, he might have had the Turks for allies in the Second World War. And even now, the Turks and the Germans, although they have their disagreements on issues, tend to like each other a great deal. That's not necessarily the case with the Russians. And so Mr. Erdogan and Mr. Putin have struggled as well, because ultimately Turkey is not European. It's external to Europe. It is a Muslim state. It is a Turkish Muslim state. It is a Sunni Muslim state. Those are its roots. It has no roots in Europe or NATO. That's absurd. So if anything, we are seeing much of the world return to normalcy. Who are the two major powers in the Middle East over the last 5,000 years? Persia, and certainly then after Persia, I would say Turkey for the last 1,000. And the Turks have been a dominant force. They came out of Central Asia. They survived the Mongolian invasions. In other words, these are very powerful figures, powerful people, powerful culture. And they are Muslims. They're not all radical Muslims by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, Turkish Islam was on the whole fairly moderate compared with the Arabs. But we're dealing with a different set of circumstances because what's happening in Gaza is enraging the entire Muslim world. This is not just another war in the Middle East between Israel, Egypt, Syria, or southern Lebanon. This is a very different animal. This is a civilizational confrontation now. And that is due largely to Mr. Netanyahu and his government that has tried to transform this into a much larger fight.
Okay. Yeah, I want to hit that topic here in a minute. Another story that I wanted to get your thoughts on that I'm having a hard time reading between the lines is they're saying that Putin's health is going downhill quickly. This might be the reason that Russia needs to end the war. Close allies, anonymous allies within the Kremlin say his health is falling apart. He realizes he's been beaten and he's humiliated. Is this Western media propaganda, or are you hearing anything about Putin's health actually deteriorating?
No. I have a great deal of difficulty with this. Mr. Putin, I think, is 69. He looks awfully good for 69. Seems to be very healthy and dynamic. Now, is there something else going on that we don't know about? Perhaps there is, but we've been treated to these rumors of Putin's imminent demise now for about the last 3 or 4 years. So I suspect there's lots of wishful thinking in the West, which is misguided, by the way, because Putin is probably the single most well-informed person inside Russia about the West. He understands the West. He understands us. This is a man who's exercised extraordinary restraint. Just the other day, somebody said, well, you keep talking about the powerful Russian forces. If that's the case, why haven't they, run up to the river, cross the river, and march to Poland? I said, because that's not what Putin wants. Putin would like to end this war. He's sitting on territory right now that is historically Russian, with Russian-speaking populations. He's going to move and take Kharkov. He will take Odessa. Those things will occur in time. But he doesn't want a war with the West or with NATO or with anybody. He just wants to get those territories under his control, get the Russians in them inside Russia, and then prevent any further oppression of the Russian population or the Tartars or anybody else inside Ukraine. That's it. He would like to see Ukraine as a neutral state. He's certainly not going to sit there and put up one more time with what we did over the last 10 years or so in Ukraine. He's not going to allow Ukraine to become this fortress for American imperial influence and NATO influence. That's not what he wants. He doesn't want Russia living under threat, just as JFK didn't want us living under the threat of nuclear missile attack from Cuba. I mean, that's about it. So I think anybody that imputes anything else to the man is just lying. There's no appetite for war anywhere else. He wants to do business with everybody. So I think I would just be very cautious about those kinds of rumors. Okay. And once you reach a certain age, once you hit 70, I would argue that after 70, every day's a gift. Yeah. I mean, you never know what's going to happen. But for a man who's been dying now for several years, he looks pretty good.
Yeah, we've had to deal with Mad Vlad. He's going crazy. We've heard Parkinson's. We've heard cancer. We've heard shaky hands, and he seems to just continue to move forward. But that was in the media today, and I try to not completely dismiss everything, but I try to take it with a grain of salt, and that's why I like to have guests like you come on. Alexander Lukashenko from Belarus is calling for this war to come to an end. He said this is going to be a long, drawn-out stalemate that will only result in more people dying. Do you think that there's any truth to what he's encouraging? Or, of course, the media is saying Lukashenko has finally flipped on Putin, but you and I both know that's not true.
No, Lukashenko is expressing a view that's widely held, I think, everywhere in Eastern Europe, but especially Russia and Belarus. First of all, he's only got 8 million people in his country. Belarus is remarkably small. But Lukashenko knows that the Ukrainians are dying by the bushel. We think that 50% of Ukraine's population has fled the country, is under Russian control now, or dead. People tell me that 500,000 Ukrainians have died. Now, during World War I, and we fought for 110 days during World War I, we sustained 318,000 casualties, and 110,000 Americans were killed. Literally, 1,000 died for every day that we fought in France. That's stunning, isn't it? Well, run the numbers. How long has Ukraine been at war with Russia? Started in February. We're still short of the 2-year mark. So if we say, what is it, 21 months or 20 months of warfare, 500,000 Ukrainians are dead. We're talking Ukrainian soldiers. So I'm not talking about civilians. And perhaps that many or more wounded, horribly wounded. We're talking about an army that is falling apart, where if you want to be evacuated by an ambulance to a reputable hospital, you have to bribe the ambulance driver and the people on the ambulance to take you there from the battlefield. You have soldiers that are kept in small groups of no more than 3 or 4 together and then sent in as replacements because they're afraid if they try to replace platoons and companies, they'll end up with a rebellion against the Ukrainian government. This war is over. But we won't let it die because the regime in Washington wants to maintain the fiction that there is something good happening in Kiev. There isn't. There's nothing there but corruption and criminality. That's the truth. The Ukrainians are dying for nothing, pointlessly, in a war that should never have been fought. That's the truth. We don't want to accept that in Washington. We have this notion, we have all sorts of false notions, that Russia is something very different from what it is, and Ukraine is something very different from what it is. Only a few people in Europe are willing to stand up and tell us the truth. But I think that too is changing. If you look at recent elections in Slovakia, I think there's a turn also in Poland that's begun that's going to become more and more powerful. I think you're going to see in Germany a hard swing to the right, along with most of Scandinavia. Everyone is sick of this left of center suicidal leadership. And I hope at some point that Americans will wake up and figure out that's what we're dealing with too. So I would right now pay very little attention to anything that comes through the Western media. You're not going to get the truth that way, at least not until governments in Europe change and not until the one here changes.
Yeah. Okay. Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen says that the United States is prepared and able to fund two wars at the same time. Is this true? Is this bluffing? Is she really just saying that Congress will do what Congress does and print more fake money?
Yes, I think that's the first impulse. But if you look at the U.S. Treasuries, the last Treasury market gathering where we tried to sell bonds failed miserably. Nobody wants to buy our bonds. Now, the Fed for a very long time has walked in and bought up bonds, but they can't really do that much longer, and they know that. You've also flooded the market with cash. And how much longer can you keep that up? I mean, these are all the questions that competent financial analysts like Alistair MacLeod in London, and I think Mohammed El Arian, they're all trying to answer these questions. They all know that we are staring into the financial abyss. So the notion that we could continue to finance two total wars, which is really what it boils down to, is absurd. It's nonsensical. But I think that this government has chosen implosion and destruction over embracing the truth and becoming rational. Any rational man would say, wait a minute, we can't do this. A rational man would pick up the phone and say, look, Bibi, you can't do what you're doing. We can't afford it. We're not going to support it. The same thing is true in Kiev. Make peace or get out. It's over. We can't afford it. That's where we're headed. Nobody wants to do that.
Yeah. Okay. Speaking of Israel and Netanyahu, the IDF in Israel announced that their ground invasion will be much slower than was originally proposed. I don't know if emotions are starting to cool or if they're just realizing Hamas is dug in deeper than they expected. Is going slow the right move? Because it seems like the world was pretty much gearing up to be against Israel, even though Israel was attacked, because they see Palestine as this small, landlocked country with no ability to defend itself, and it's 50% of its population are children.
Bear with me. In 1227, an English army was sent to Scotland by Edward I. The army met a Scottish force in the vicinity of a place called Stirling Bridge. Ultimately, the English army was destroyed, was defeated. It wasn't simply defeated. The Scots then proceeded to murder everybody in the organization. Very few people managed to get back to the border with England and escape with their lives. The hero of Scottish history, Sir William Wallace, got a hold of the commanders, the two leading knights who commanded the army, skinned them alive, killed them, but then skinned them alive before he did it, and then had belts that he wore for the rest of his life made from their hides. Now, why? Because Scotland and Scots had been subjected in the previous 100 years to horrific treatment by invading English forces. So they exploded with rage and anger, and the violence was outrageous, unbelievable. Today we look at that and we're just shocked. How could you make a man your national hero that skins people alive and makes belts out of their hide? Well, let's fast forward to Israel. There is so much blood in the sand in that part of the world involving the Palestinian Arabs and Arabs in general, Muslims, and the Jews who live in Israel, that we can't begin to line it up and explain it. What you witnessed on the 7th of October was horrific, barbarous, and savage. And if I were an Israeli, I would react exactly as they have. But it shouldn't come as a surprise, because the people living in Gaza have been living in what some people term the largest open-air concentration camp in the world. Now, some of that is their fault, and some of it is the fault, frankly, of the Israelis and also of the Arab states in the region, because you have Arab states in the region with enormous quantities of money who could have always intervened to help the people in Gaza and find a way out, even if it meant relocating them. But the Arab states in the region didn't want to do that. They didn't want any of these people in their country, and they saw value in maintaining the Palestinian Arab in a terrible position because it represented a permanent threat and irritant to the Israelis. Now, the Israelis, in the meantime, could they have done things differently? Well, of course, but we don't know the whole story. We can't recount everything here. My point is that this is not something that suddenly happened that was never going to happen. This was inevitable. The circumstances changed, and it happened. The question is, what are you going to do about it? And the Israelis have decided that it's time for the people in Gaza to go away. This is not an exercise in counterinsurgency. The Israelis are not clearing and holding something. They are expelling or killing and then permanently removing whatever they find. And their view is, if you're there with Hamas, if you're in the vicinity of Hamas, you're an enemy. You're a combatant. You deserve to die. Now, we in the United States, as a general rule, do not support collective punishment, which is what we're talking about. We find that unacceptable, violating the so-called laws of war and humanity. But that's what's happening. And the Israelis, as a result, have provoked the entire Muslim world. I told a friend of mine who actually, we've known each other for years. He's also an Israeli citizen. And he pointed out, he said, Douglas, we have managed something no one else in history has done. We have united the Sunni and the Shia. Well, he's right.
Yeah,
he's right. That's the problem. And never before have the Israelis had to face in direct combat Turks, Persians, and Arabs all together. That's where we're headed. That's why I wrote the piece I did in the American Conservative called Avoiding Armageddon. If something isn't done and the Israelis go into Gaza and continue these operations, not only will they face Hezbollah on the northern front, they're going to face the rest of the region. Egypt, Jordan, they have no interest in going to war, but they will have to do it. They will have to fight because these are Muslims and they will be accused of heinous crimes if they stand by and watch their fellow Muslims be slaughtered. The same thing is true in Turkey with Mr. Erdogan. I'm sure you saw the 1.5 million people show up in Istanbul to cheer Mr. Erdogan, who called the Israeli state a war criminal state. People are genuinely enraged. This includes people that don't necessarily like Erdogan, just as many Israelis are now supporting Netanyahu who don't really like Netanyahu because they see no alternative to this. Now, here's the wild card. The wild card is us. And the Israelis have worked tirelessly to cultivate control of our government. Our government is signed up to support Israel unconditionally, which means we are being pulled into a major regional war. We are going to be pitted against the Turks, the Iranians, all the Sunni Arab states in the region, probably states in North Africa. This will probably have an impact on the Muslims in India and certainly Pakistan. I would be surprised if it didn't also have an impact on us in Malaysia and Indonesia. And what I continue to ask people is, what makes you think Israel will survive this? That's my concern. I support Israel. I've always supported its right to exist. I think Israel should exist. I don't want to see it destroyed. But they are in a position right now where they have created an alliance against them that even with our help and assistance may not work. In other words, they may not survive. They may not prevail. I think that would be a tragedy. So it's why I have said repeatedly, we have to save Israel from itself. We understand the anger and the emotion, but we have no leadership and we have no strategy. If someone were more rational in Washington, they would look at this and say, we've got to put the brakes on or Israel will be lost. And what we don't understand is that in 1973, which is the last major conflict the Israelis fought with Egypt and Syria, that part of the world was very different. Today, these countries contain millions, hundreds of millions of people who are much better educated than they were in 1973, who have better technology, particularly technology involving media, information exchange, unmanned systems, robotics. I could go down an endless list. If you look at Iran, it has a brilliant air and space program, fine engineers that have done marvelous things with very little to build some of the best theater ballistic missiles in the world. I haven't even mentioned the unmanned systems in the form of the various drones. The Turks are similar, only the Turks have a long martial history. They're the most militant state in the region, one of the most militant populations in the world. Anyone who has dealt with the Turks knows this. Fighting the Turks is a fight to the finish. If they become involved, and I think they will, if this continues, I don't see how the Israelis survive it. And I know they have nuclear weapons, but people forget the Pakistanis have made it very clear that the Turks will be given nuclear warheads if they need it, primarily for the purpose of deterring Israel. Now, if that happens and the Israelis decide to use a nuclear weapon, we can only begin to imagine the consequences. And I would prefer that they didn't. But they have it, and they've always reserved the right to use it if they see fit. Where does this leave us? On the one hand, we want to support Israel, but do you help a man that you love and care for commit suicide? I wouldn't.
Yeah.
I wouldn't allow a good friend to commit suicide. And if I were in power, I would not allow Netanyahu to lead this country on the path to suicide. And that's where I think they're headed. And it would be a tragedy for the world if that were to happen.
Yeah. This has been my concern. I've been texting with Larry Johnson saying, on October 7th, I was horrified. By the 8th, 9th, and 10th, I was worried Israel was going to wake up a whole bunch of past enemies that will join forces and collapse, almost like pushing a boulder up a hill and then it rolls back on you and crushes you. And so I've been grateful to see them slow things down, but I do worry that they're going to provoke something that they can't control and they can't defend themselves against, because at the end of the day, they're a vital nation. The technology, the medical that comes out of there is second to none. But they also have a lot of enemies. And like you say, there's so much blood in that sand for thousands of years. It's a ball of yarn that none of us can unravel in a podcast because it's so complicated.
Yeah, well, right now, Stephen, the Israelis are going to complete this mission. They're devoted to it. They're committed to it. I understand that. My fear is it will be the end of them. But no one should doubt that the Israeli Defense Force will do this. Now, in the meantime, as this war widens, which it will, and we become involved, because we will become involved if Hezbollah attacks, it's been made very clear in the press that we will go to the aid of Israel. In other words, we'll compensate for the Israeli presence in the West Bank, which is going to revolt, and its presence in Gaza. We'll compensate by sending aircraft, I'm sure, from the aircraft carriers and other locations in to help. The problem is that there are new technologies in the region now. You have the Russian S-400 and you have S-300s. You've got a lot of different air defense missions. We will not escape casualties. We will take casualties. You also have navies at sea that are a problem. We're looking at the 100+ ships that put on a performance for Erdogan on the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Turkish Republic just the other day. But the Turks have very fine submarines. Interestingly enough, they have the same submarines that the Israelis do that were built in Germany. Of course, the ones that the Germans built for the Israelis were built free of charge, but the Turks paid for these, and they're very deadly. These are diesel-electric submarines that are very tough to track, very effective in shallow water, and, by the standards of the United States Navy, the Eastern Mediterranean is a puddle. Our preferred areas of operation are the Atlantic and the Pacific. It's very difficult to take us on in the Pacific. If anybody tried to attack or invade us, we'd meet them in the mid-Pacific and they'd never get anywhere. This is different. We're too close to too many land masses that could exact a price from us. So I don't know what happens to us, but it's not going to be cost-free. Let's put it that way. And then beyond that, we may not even succeed in our ultimate goal, which is to preserve and rescue Israel. That's the problem. And the secondary and tertiary effects, the downstream effects, whatever you want to call them. You close the Straits of Hormuz. You close the Suez Canal. You shut off all the oil, all the energy that comes out of that region. Now, we say, well, we have energy. Well, that's true, but we have systematically undermined our own energy sector since Biden came to office. It's going to take us years to recover. You can't get people to provide the enormous investment that's required for drilling unless they see evidence that there's a long-term strategic payoff. In other words, that they'll survive. What they can't go through is making all of those investments, lose all that money when someone steps up and says, sorry, new Green Deal again, you're out. So this is a problem in Europe. It's a problem in the United States. Now, you mentioned Europe earlier. The massive numbers of millions of people from the Middle East and Africa in particular, not exclusively, but largely from those areas that have poured into Europe, were never there for the purpose of, let us say, becoming Europeans.
Yeah.
That's all nonsense. In fact, Mr. Erdogan was very clear to the Turks living in Vienna that they had done more to advance the cause of Islam by coming and settling in Austria and Germany than they ever did with the Ottoman armies that once besieged Vienna the last time in 1683. They see themselves as conquering through reproduction. And these people are not friends of the civilization in which they currently reside. I cannot imagine this ending well in Europe. Either Europe defends itself and attacks this alien entity in its environment, or Europe ceases to exist. So for Europe, the existential threat is not external, it's inside. It's not Russia, never has been. It certainly isn't China. The existential threat to Western civilization on the European continent is living in Germany, living in France, living in Italy, living in Great Britain. So we'll see what they do. But if they're going to survive, they're not going to be able to tolerate it for very long. Now, of course, there are people that are saying, well, this is the spread of anti-Semitism. You look at these people in Chicago or somewhere else. But again, you've got to be careful. There isn't very much antipathy for Jews. There's antipathy for Israel because of what it's doing. And I don't think that's well understood. It's this whole policy of collective punishment that people are having difficulty supporting.
Yeah. Ugh, what a mess. Final question. Do you see this issue in the Middle East and Israel being more dangerous to global peace and stability than the Russia-Ukraine situation?
Oh, yes, because you have a rational actor in Moscow. There is no rational actor in Washington. That's the problem. The rational actor is sitting in Moscow. He says, look, I don't want to kill Ukrainians. He never did. This is what people don't understand. The Russians look upon the Ukrainians as Orthodox Christian Slavs. Why should they kill Orthodox Christian Slavs? They felt they were left with no alternative. Ukrainians, as a people, don't understand the extent to which they've been manipulated into this war. And Ukrainians are very fine people. They're nationalistic, they're committed, but they're also living in the past. They're mistaking Russia for the Soviet Union. It's not. They're mistaking Russia for communism. It's not. And that has helped fuel this horrible, pointless, destructive war. We've got to stop it. And I think the European governments that are going to come to power when they throw the current ones out will eventually do that. They'll contribute to an end to this. But here, as long as this regime in Washington is still in power, nothing will change. And we will be hounded into war in the Middle East for something that just doesn't make any sense, that ultimately will, I think, destroy Israel. So I don't see any sober analysis. And again, a lot of this is our ignorance and arrogance. Oh, the Arabs, they can't do anything right. Who are they? Oh, the Turks, who are they? The Iranians, who are they? I mean, we dismiss everyone who is different from ourselves. We did that before the Second World War. We dismissed the Japanese out of hand. Even before we landed in Normandy, if you read the assessments that were written about the German army, they were fanciful. Oh, the Germans can't think. They have no initiative. Who the hell came up with this? It was an army without any tactical air support that practically fought us to a standstill. It took us months to overcome them. So it's ridiculous. We are arrogant and we are ignorant, and we lack respect for other people's cultures and ways of life, because we continue to insist, if you're not like us, in other words, you don't adopt what we think is appropriate for you in terms of whatever we think democracy is, that word that is just abused all the time, then you're the enemy and you deserve the worst, which is ridiculous, absurd, never made any sense. And it doesn't make any sense today. But how do you persuade Americans to abandon this extreme arrogance that has been inculcated in us, particularly, I would argue, over the last 30 years? It's always been a problem, but it's gotten really out of hand now. I frankly don't believe that the average American, if he were asked on a ballot, do you support becoming a co-belligerent in a regional war in the Middle East, would say yes. I don't think so.
Yeah.
There are limits. Washington said no nation can be expected to move beyond the limits of its own interests. He was correct. We have been operating well beyond the limits of our interests, I would say, for the last 30 years, probably longer.
Yeah. Wow. Lots going on. Thank you, Colonel Macgregor, for coming on and giving us your analysis and your feedback. Let's hope and pray that things don't get out of hand. But as you say, that there's no real good analysis out there that doesn't look more dangerous than what you and I have been covering the last year.
Well, I think everyone at the moment is driven exclusively by emotion. So there isn't a great deal of thinking. If anyone's thinking at all right now, unfortunately, I think it's in the opposite camp, in the region. They're thinking carefully about what steps they want to take and how they'll do it. We really haven't done that.
Wow. Well, thank you very much. I know you need to run. I appreciate your time. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Hàng thứ 12, đầu tiên móc một đơn một dàn. Móc 6 đơn một dàn. Móc 2 đơn một dàn. Sáu đơn một dàn một đơn. Hàng 13 móc 20 một đơn. móc 1 tăng 8 đơn, 1 tăng 2 lần. Hàng 15 móc 24 mỗi đơn. Hàng 16 móc 2 đơn, móc 2 tăng 10 đơn 2 lần. Hàng 17 đến hàng 21, mỗi hàng móc 28 mỗi đơn.
I'm joined today by Colonel Douglas Macgregor, and I appreciate him coming on. I want to get down to the truth about what's going on with Ukraine, Putin, this war that we've all been roped into. I believe the mainstream media is misleading Americans with propaganda in order to justify the use of our tax dollars and the military-industrial complex. So thank you, sir, so much for coming on today.
Sure, absolutely.
So the first question that I wanted to get down to is who is it that really wants this war between NATO and Vladimir Putin? Because from what I'm seeing outside of CNN and other mainstream media is it seems like it's the politicians in Washington, D.C. that are more eager to fight this battle through Ukraine against Putin. And it doesn't seem as if the Pentagon is as on board as the politicians. Who's really behind wanting this war?
Well, I think it's clear that the American people are largely divorced from the reality of this conflict, as they have been for the last 30 years, divorced from all the conflicts. War has always been something that happened far away on somebody else's soil. The difference this time is that Washington has decided, along with help and assistance, particularly from its allies in London and the global financial community run out of New York City, to wage war on the Russian state with the goal of not simply regime change, but ultimately destroying the state, potentially dismembering it. And when you look at the people who are advocates for this terrible, destructive policy, they are largely the same people that got us into the Balkans in the 1990s, into Bosnia and Kosovo, and then subsequently were largely supportive of the interventions in 2001 and 3 for perpetual warfare in the Middle East, demonizing and transforming into an enemy Libya, Syria, and obviously Iran. This is an old story. It's the same old trope that you've been hearing. It's 1936 again. We have another potential Hitlerian state, and if we don't act, we are appeasers, and the world as we know it will end. So that's about it. But I think there's a lot of money behind this because Russia is full of trillions of dollars of resources, mineral resources, oil, gas, precious metals, agricultural. We just go down the list. There was an attempt in the 90s and in the early part of this century by people from the West, many of whom are connected to organizations like Goldman Sachs and the global financial community, to go in and effectively rape Russia and steal everything they possibly could from it. They were ultimately defeated and thrown out by Vladimir Putin, who established a new regime to bring some more stability and dignity back to the Russian state. He has been talking now for many, many years about the unacceptable policy of advancing NATO to Russia's borders. And he's been warning over and over and over again, if you do this, you will inevitably come into conflict with us. We will not tolerate a large NATO presence. And when you say NATO presence, read the potential for U.S. ballistic and cruise missiles and so forth on the border. And we've taken the position in Washington, that is the political elite, the ruling elite of our country, that Russia is weak, that Russia can be bullied, and all we have to do is apply great pressure. And since we dominate the global financial system, we can isolate it. And this ruling political elite embraces most of both parties. And so we are embarked upon this very dangerous course of conflict and confrontation now with the Russian state and its armed forces. The Washington community that sponsors this has obviously enriched itself over the last 30 plus years through all the various interventions and the massive increases in defense spending. But it actually goes beyond that. It goes to the reconstruction costs, rebuilding costs, and the introduction of U.S. firms and interests into other countries. It's a kind of new imperialism that we've been embarked upon. And Russia is simply the latest target. The problem for the ruling elites in Washington is twofold. First of all, most of them are ignorant of reality. They know nothing about the world beyond our borders. They know nothing about military power. And so they badly miscalculated with Russia. This was a war that should have ended in a few weeks because Russia would collapse, or at least in a few months because Russia would collapse. This is a war that should have ended because Russia can't produce enough ammunition. This is a war that should have ended because of horrendous and horrific casualties taken exclusively by the Russians. And all we have to do is arm this Proxy, this Ukrainian force that we built after 2014, once we had established a government in Kiev that would do our bidding. And this force in Ukraine would devastate Russia. Well, it hasn't quite worked out that way, has it? So now we face a very different set of circumstances. But when you ask who is behind it, you've got to look at a whole range of people. And remember that the preeminent goal in Washington for most politicians is to stay in office and continue to enrich themselves. Therefore, they pay a great deal of attention to their donors. Who are the donors? You have to go and look at the oligarchic class of people that drive policy, that keep us in a state of perpetual conflict with a whole range of people and nations. Who are they? Then look at the industries in which they are invested and which support these policies. When you look at those things carefully, in other words, it boils down very simply to follow the money. When you do that, you begin to understand that what's happening in Washington has nothing to do with the American people or United States interests. No one in the United States, or very few people in the United States know where Ukraine is. They could care less. And when you ask about NATO, people will say, oh, yeah, sure, that's important, I guess. What is it? I mean, this is the problem with just about everything I think that's been happening in the United States since the end of the Second World War. Most Americans aren't terribly interested on what goes on beyond the borders of their own country. I mean, frankly, most of what happens around the world on any given day doesn't make much difference to us. So you've got a ruling class that says, no, we want to be engaged everywhere because it's beneficial. That ruling class is diverse, but again, it embraces both sides of the political spectrum. That's why if you're expecting a Republican-controlled House to suddenly dramatically, shift into reverse gear and stop something, you're very much mistaken. Most of them will vote with the left, just as most of the left will vote with them. Why? To keep the money flowing. It benefits them because it benefits their donors. And again, there's no understanding. If you look at this balloon business, if I could just stop for a second. We sent an F-22, the most expensive aircraft ever built, out to shoot down a balloon. And the Chinese had told us, well, it's a weather balloon. But of course, you never believe anything the Chinese say because the Chinese are now enemies and they always lie. But let's look at the facts. The Chinese have 300 satellites, 300 in space. Of that number, almost a third have military application. The Chinese have their own global positioning system, just like the Russians, just as we do. They have the same capability to monitor what happens from 100,000 feet in space that we do. They can read the names on gravestones, and if they want to monitor the conversations in the White House, they can do it. All right? Why are we worried about this flimsy balloon that is too small to carry a significant payload? It can't even communicate with China. It's on the wrong side of the world. The only way it could communicate is to send data to satellites. Meanwhile, our border is open. Thousands of Chinese, thousands of Russians, and others from all over the world have been pouring in. Where are they? What are they doing? Are our nuclear power stations secure? What about these people? Are they near any of our military installations? How many of them are agents? How many Chinese scientists and engineers are working in our laboratories? This is all nonsense, what we're hearing about the stupid balloon. They're missing the point. Washington needs to be held accountable for its incalculable negligence and mendacity. I agree with that. But you're not going to get anything out of the balloon. You need to turn to the really substantive issues. Why are our borders open? Why do we have 100,000 troops in Europe, including almost 50,000 in Poland, and none on our borders? There's no threat to Europe from Russia. Russia is not interested in invading Europe. This is all nonsense. This was cooked up for years to try and demonize Putin and turn him again into another Hitler figure. It's the same old trope. It's the same people doing these things over and over and over again. At some point, the American people need to become engaged and put an end to it. That's the easiest way I can put it.
Yeah. So do you think this spy balloon is to then embarrass President Biden right before the State of the Union, or because they started saying, oh, well, they came in with Trump, but now we can't prove it, and national intelligence didn't ever communicate this to that president. Is this just a giant distraction for the American people so they don't actually look at what's happening within our own borders or at our border?
Well, I think so. Undoubtedly, you have the usual suspects on the right who will grasp at anything to attack Biden. But the truth is that if you want to go after Biden, you've got lots of reasons to do it that have nothing to do with the weather balloon. But for some reason, a lot of people on the Hill, I don't think they understand what you and I just discussed. They don't understand the Chinese satellite array. They don't understand that the Chinese from space can track every surface combatant in the United States Navy 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And any U.S. surface warship that comes within 200 nautical miles, that location data can be turned into targeting data that results instantly in the launch of missiles to sink it. Now, that's serious. That's a real threat. It doesn't necessarily mean we have to go to war, but it's something we should be aware of. Listening to congressmen and senators talk, you'd think they knew absolutely nothing about the true state of affairs. We can't recruit for our armed forces. People say the volunteer force is imploding. I think there's a lot of evidence for that. Has anybody raised that with Biden? And today, I think it's the CEO of Bank of America is worried about default. And you have Janice Yellen running around as the Secretary of the Treasury saying, well, we could default. We must not default. We've never defaulted. Well, first of all, we have defaulted. We defaulted in 32 and 34. We just called it restructuring the debt. We defaulted in 1971 when we went off the gold standard because we could not cope with the enormous debt being amassed as a result of Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty and the war in Vietnam. So we've been down this road before. Nobody wants to admit those things. So we run around and say, we have to pay our debts. We have to pay our debts. We have to pay our debts. You've got CEOs now saying, how are we going to do that? How is it possible? Nobody's telling the truth about the bond market. You've got to look at everything, the holistic picture. Any normal population with representatives who actually cared about the United States would be addressing these matters and ultimately be arguing for the removal of this president and his administration for incompetence and mendacity. There's no rule of law in our cities anymore. How much criminality do you want in the United States? How much is acceptable? Apparently, we've decided a certain amount of criminality is now acceptable. Yet it's the rule of law in the United States that underpins our economy, has made us great and powerful. And what about all the jobs and the industries that have been shipped overseas? Have they come back? Is there any effort to bring them back? What are we doing? Americans need to wake up. Forget the balloon. These are serious issues. We got a State of the Union address tonight. What's he going to talk about? Nothing. It'll be another exercise in happy talk because everybody in Washington has figured out that happy talk is the real opium of the people.
Yeah, they got us smoking hopium. We're all just living on hope. Okay, going back to power and Biden, Gerald Celente of the Trends Journal says, when all else fails, they take you to war. There was a RAND report that was put out before the invasion from Russia into Ukraine. Did the United States trigger that invasion in order to bolster Biden in the polls, or was Putin going to invade regardless and we just happened to point it out before it happened? What really triggered Putin going into Ukraine?
Well, first of all, discard RAND. RAND is part of the Beltway. It's a status quo think tank that is paid by federal monies. Anything they say is effectively designed to justify, support, extend the status quo.
Okay.
Let's talk about Putin. I told you before that starting with the acquisition of the East European states, these were the ones that were formerly under the Warsaw Pact. The Russians had been told by us that we would not do that. We would not exploit their weakness in order to advance the borders of NATO further east. We lied. And Putin put up with it. He put up with Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Slovakia, Poland, ultimately Hungary, and Romania and Bulgaria. But then we started talking about Georgia and Ukraine, states that actually border Russia. And he said, no, we're not going to tolerate this. And he told us that if we insisted upon this, they would take action to secure their borders. Now, understand that in Ukraine, we spent a lot of money over the last 10 years. You got to go back to 2014 and look at the coup that brings to power a government that was not duly elected. That government was picked, cultivated, developed, and ultimately led by people from Washington. Victoria Nuland is the most, well-known figure, but she's hardly the only one. And working together with people in the State Department and the same individuals that I mentioned before who were part of the interventions in the Balkans and Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and so forth, all of those people are part of this cabal bringing this war to fruition. Now, in truth, as I said before, they miscalculated. I don't think they believed, frankly speaking, that Putin was going to do what he did. Even in December of 2021, when he said, look, I'm willing to talk But there's certain things you cannot do. We will not accept Ukrainian membership. Ukraine can become neutral. We can talk about that. But I will not tolerate a NATO membership for Ukraine. It poses a threat to us. And of course, we said, oh, well, that's ridiculous. We don't threaten Russia. Well, if you look at Ukraine now, you look at the force we built, you look at all the biolabs we've established in that place, which I think is another issue that deserves closer scrutiny than it's gotten. You begin to say, well, if we had no malicious intent, why were we doing the things we were doing? Why were we building them up? Why were we cultivating the hatred and hostility for Russia? And where did this man Zelensky come from? Remember, Zelensky was an unknown comedian of questionable value who shows up out of nowhere and he becomes the head of state. And remember, he ran on a platform that told the Ukrainians, we want peace with Russia. We have to find a way forward that's peaceful. He was elected overwhelmingly on that platform. Wow. Then he did a 180 and turned into the most, vicious Russian hater and warlike individual they've ever had. The funny thing about Zelensky is that when he was elected, he could not speak a word of Ukrainian. Oh, wow. He grew up speaking only Russian. That was an embarrassment to our State Department, as I learned when I spent some time there. And they worked hard for several months to bring him up to speed. It's not that Ukrainian and Russian are so different that in a few months one can't master the other. But nevertheless, stop and think about that. But he had a huge, huge support from the Ukrainian people, which tells you the masses of Ukrainians want nothing to do with the war against Russia. But this was then brought on. And I think what happened is that the so-called neocon globalists in the Beltway, who are at all the various think tanks, thought that Russia could be bullied. And they kept saying, oh, they won't do anything. Putin won't do anything. I was interviewed by Dmitry Simes in January of last year. And I was asked point blank, do you think Russia will go? And I said, absolutely. This is a huge danger to Russian national security. They're not going to sit there. The reason they went into Crimea was not just because historically it had been Russian. They didn't want it to become a NATO naval base in the Black Sea. I mean, there are reasons why actions were taken. So this was foreseeable, but people in Washington miscalculated. And then when Putin went in and essentially moved very carefully and cautiously with a goal of minimizing destruction of human life and property, because he did not want a war with the Ukrainian people, everyone said, oh, well, look at him. Look at the Russians. They're incompetent. They didn't do what we did in Iraq. They did not destroy virtually anything that did not move and then try to attack anything that did. In other words, there was no shock and awe. Well, of course not. That's not what he wanted. And it took several months for him, sadly, and his colleagues in Moscow to figure out there's nobody to talk to. They're not going to negotiate with us. And so we go into this new setting where he says, we've got to go onto a war footing. We're going to have to expand the armed forces. We're going to have to build it up. And then we're going to have to go into an economy of force mode for months until we're ready to strike back. Well, that's what's happened. And the sad part is that all of it was avoidable. It was never necessary. And remember that Mr. Burns, who is the former ambassador to the Soviet or Russia under, I guess, Obama, he was the one that wrote the memorandum that said no means niet, or niet means no. In other words, don't expand any further, don't go into Ukraine. And subsequently, he was sent within the last few months to try and hammer out a deal. And that's understandable why he would. Ukraine is falling apart. They are the ones who've taken horrific casualties. They are now dragging 16-year-old boys into the armed forces at gunpoint. They are still taking heavy casualties, and 75% of their casualties have been from artillery systems, strike systems such as rocket artillery, missiles, aviation, and artillery, all of those together, 75% of their casualties. And they can't protect themselves. They don't have the air defense. They don't have the expertise. And we have been feeding them, again, equipment just enough, allegedly, to keep them alive until we finally discovered, my goodness, these people are about to go under. And that's what Secretary Austin effectively told the conference a couple of weeks ago. If we've got to give them this equipment soon because the window of opportunity is closing. Soon we won't be able to affect this. Yeah, of course. And it's all unnecessary. And millions of people are being destroyed by this.
Yeah, it's it's been very interesting to watch the mainstream media because I cover the news, and so I have to at least see what they're doing, but then get these underground reports from you and from other people, Scott Ritter and others, and really see what's going on. I remember early in the war, I said to my YouTube community, I have no military background, but it seems like Putin is slow walking this invasion in order to get people to flee so that he's not causing mass casualty. And yet the mainstream media perceive that as Putin's weak, but he's also crazy. He's lost his mind. He's this new Hitler. And we were totally being fed a bunch of BS. And now we're saying, okay, wait a minute, this thing's actually going to fall. But now we're sending in tanks, and everyone's smoking the hopium that these tanks are going to be the new savior of Ukraine. I know you have, intel and opinions on the tank situation. What's really going on with the tanks that are going to be sent to Ukraine?
Well, I think the administration pulled off a brilliant scam in order to trap the Germans into supporting something they didn't want to support. And that was by saying, okay, we'll send tanks. And then we said, we're going to send 31. But then we added, they'll have to be built from scratch. We can't send the ones that we have because of various technologies involved in these tanks that we don't want to fall into the hands of the Russians. So we have to build a model that we can safely send to Ukraine so that in the event the tank is destroyed or is captured, we're not putting at risk sensitive technologies and capabilities. So now we're looking at tanks arriving in 6 months, 7 months, 8 months. And then the usual suspects on the Army side are saying, well, we'll have to build up an entire logistical infrastructure and network. Well, that's true. But that's something that people should have thought about before they launched this war. There was nothing in Ukraine to support anything beyond the first few weeks. So those tanks aren't coming anytime soon. Meanwhile, the Germans are now saying, oh, we can't send our best tanks either. We'll have to send old Leopards. We'll let our allies who have some Leopards send them if they like. They can do that. We give permission. But we're only going to send, I think the latest count from the Germans was 14. But then they assumed that all the other Europeans that have Leopard tanks would send those. And they said that'll bring your total to 88 or 2 battalions. Doesn't look like, with the exception of the Poles, the rest of them are going to give up their Leopard tanks. So I think, frankly, it's much ado about nothing. And again, anyone who looks at what's happened in Ukraine understands that warfare has changed rather profoundly. Warfare is not going to be dominated by armor on the ground as it once was. What dominates warfare today is something I've been writing about for 30 years off and on, and that is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance linked to strike systems, rocket artillery, missiles, conventional artillery. That's what's dominating the battlefield. That's what's lethal. Now, sometimes it comes in the form of a small handheld weapon system, but most of the damage is really done by much larger, more powerful precision-guided munitions and missiles. The Russians understand this. They were the first to recognize this back in the 1970s. This is now being employed. So if you send armor anywhere without substantial air defense support to try and defeat these missile threats from drones, from terminally guided systems, whatever, you're not going to have tanks for very long. You could watch 88 tanks vaporize in a few minutes. And at the same time, your infantry has to be there in the form of armored fighting vehicles with lots of firepower and, again, lots of overhead protection. Top attack from ISR strike dominates the battlefield now. Precision has made it extremely lethal. And that's why, if you look at the Russians, excuse me, they are moving very deliberately, very slowly, advancing under the umbrella of this ISR strike. They don't have to make any mad dashes to Kiev or across the river to hold something and wait for reinforcements. They have effectively created steamrollers. The steamroller is supported by this top attack system, the ISR strike complex, the overhead surveillance. And it's working very effectively. It's protecting their forces and absolutely devastating the enemy. And then as they need to, they move forward their armored force on the ground and their direct fire capabilities with the infantry and the armor, and they annihilate whatever is left after they've disrupted, disintegrated, atomized, you whatever words you want, the front. That front in southern Ukraine is crumbling. It's falling apart. It's almost completely destroyed at this point. And how many casualties the Ukrainians have had is anybody's guess. I've heard from 157,000 dead up to over 200,000 dead. I've heard 400,000 casualties. I've heard 500,000 casualties. No one is telling the truth in the West. The only way you can find these things out is by talking to people on the ground. Ukrainians, Russians, and Poles are very helpful, and they will tell you the truth. And the American people haven't been told the truth, and they don't understand that we are not in a position to go to war with anyone today. We're not. We don't have munitions factories, armaments factories, turning out equipment 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The Russians do. Their factories are humming. There's no shortage of anything. In fact, what they've done recently, according to the most recent reports I've seen, is that they've walked back from some of the major overhead strikes. They have the capacity to fire 60,000 rounds a day, including rockets and missiles at the Ukrainians. 60,000 rounds. But they've been walking that back, and the Ukrainians who are watching this, and the Poles and others are saying the Russians are husbanding these for the coming offensive. And this offensive is coming. There are 700,000 troops all the way around Ukraine. Of that number, probably 250 to 300,000 are combat forces. In other words, the people that actually go forward and kill the enemy. They're going to move. And when they move, this steamroller will go forward as I've described. And they will annihilate what is left. And it doesn't make any difference what you send to the Ukrainians. They can't be trained fast enough. There are not enough of them left anymore that can do anything. If you're starting to drag 16-year-old boys off the street, away from their families, into uniform, what kind of a situation do you think you confront? It's terrible. And it's not necessary. We've done this to the Ukrainians. This nation is almost destroyed. There are between 18 and 22 million Ukrainians left in the territory that Zelensky and his friends in Kyiv control. More than 10 million have left the country. 4 million are Russians living under Russian administration and are quite happy about it in the East. And then you have the casualties. And then you have 2 million that were already in the West working in the EU and Great Britain. And the sum at the beginning was never more than about 37.4 million. So this whole thing is a catastrophe. We're killing the Ukrainian nation. We're killing the Ukrainian state. And this is not something that was inevitable. But we were not willing to consider neutrality for Ukraine.
Yeah.
And yet we have decades of experience with neutrality in Austria that worked very well. When Austria finally secured neutrality, Eisenhower, who then was president, was greatly relieved. He kept saying, we don't have the forces to protect all these countries. Let's make as many of them neutral as possible. He wanted to neutralize Poland. He wanted to neutralize many of these states that are now part of NATO. He said, we can't defend them. We can't defend them now, Stephen. We can't.
Yeah. Final question. I know how busy you are. Thank you. This has been, I've learned at least a dozen new things, and I read a lot. So thank you for your wisdom. Is Washington, D.C. and NATO going to pull us into World War III? Are they going to trigger Belarus teaming up with Putin and coming in from the north? Are we going to be pushing Poland and Germany in? Or is this thing going to find resolution once Ukraine can no longer sustain itself and the money stops pouring in? Where do you see this going at this moment?
Well, the senior military leaders in the Pentagon know that we are not prepared for a military confrontation with Russia in Eastern Europe. They understand that. Remember, we are predominantly an aerospace and maritime power. We're prepared to defeat anyone who threatens the United States. Ideally, we'd like to meet our enemies somewhere in the mid-Atlantic or in the mid-Pacific, not on the Eurasian continent. Our army is pitifully small and pitifully incapable for what we would want it to do. It needs to be larger and more capable, but we've been destroying the armed forces now for a long time with all sorts of terrible policies that undermine discipline, cohesion, and destroy good leadership. So I think that we can avoid this confrontation. And I think there's a predisposition to do that. I think the amateurs in the White House recognize privately that they're in a lot of trouble. They've pushed this too far. And they're going to be embarrassed badly as they watch the steamroller eliminate what's left of the Ukrainian armed forces. Whether or not we at that point will step forward and admit, look, you're successful, you're victorious, we recognize that. We're prepared for some solution that guarantees neutrality for Ukraine, I don't know. If there's one thing politicians in Washington are loath to do, it's to admit that they're wrong, that they made a mistake. Nobody does that. But let's be frank, we have. We've made a very serious mistake. And this is destroying NATO. This is the other truth that hides behind the facade of NATO is more united than ever. Well, got news for you. No. Behind the scenes, lots of the people in Europe are asking the same question you are. What have we gotten ourselves into? I mean, NATO was founded as a defensive alliance. Nobody signed up for war with Russia. Oh, sure, you have, I think, dangerous, unbalanced people in places like Warsaw and Vilnius that talk about that. But ultimately, the majority of the population, the majority of the leaders inside NATO, they don't want to go to war with Russia, and they're no more ready for it than we are. They would like to see an end to this. We don't want it to end on terms that don't favor us. And we think the only thing that favors us is the destruction of Russia. It's humiliation. Well, that's absurd. Ultimately, everyone wants to get back to normalcy. We should want to get back to normalcy too, and wash our hands of these bad policies. But until the American people realize that Washington is populated with these people, that the people in Washington, this ruling class, is not acting in their interests and demand fundamental sweeping change, I don't know how we avoid at least the potential for what you described, because you can still have accidents.
Yeah. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to share this understanding, this wisdom, this information. You've got a brilliant military mind. I know you've written many books. You have one that came out recently. What is the name of that title? And I'll make sure to put a link below so people can look at that.
Yeah, Margin of Victory. And I think a lot of people would find it interesting because it traces the emergence of what we've been discussing, this new form of warfare, the links between space-based surveillance, reconnaissance, intelligence, and systems on the ground that are destructive and precise. And that's the way of war in the future. So adding 500 or 1,000 tanks is not the answer. We're still going to have tanks. We're going to have lots of things that we've had in the past in the future, not as many of them. There'll be different organizations, different designs. And that's what Americans have to understand. We continue to cling to the old World War II model. That's not the future.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Colonel Macgregor, for your time and also for your service to our country. Have a great rest of your day.
Same to you, my friend. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Hàng thứ 12, đầu tiên móc một đơn một giảm. Móc 6 đơn một giảm. Móc 2 đơn một giảm. Sáu đơn một giảm một đơn. Hàng 13 móc 20 mũi đơn. Hàng 14 móc 1 tăng 8 đơn. 1 tăng 2 lần. Hàng 15 móc 24 mũi đơn. Hàng 16 móc 2 đơn, móc 2 tăng 10 đơn 2 lần. Hàng 17 đến hàng 21, mỗi hàng móc 28 mũi đơn.
Colonel, welcome back to the show, my dear friend. Always a pleasure.
Thanks.
What would have happened to you as a tank commander in the Middle East, a full bird colonel, if you suddenly disappeared for 10 days and didn't tell your superiors, your colleagues, or even your people you commanded where you were?
Well, the best thing I can say is that I've been in a lot of trouble, and everybody would have noticed, and the usual suspects would have been out with the guard dogs trying to hunt me down.
But the Secretary of Defense, through whom the codes for, correct me if I'm wrong, use of nuclear weapons passes, and theoretically through whom all military behavior must be approved or authorized, was in whereabouts unknown for the President of the United States for at least 10 days. How dangerous is that?
Well, it's dangerous, but I'm not sure we have a full picture. Clearly, the Secretary of Defense is very close to the president. You could effectively regard him as a deputy commander in chief. People are confused because they impute such powers to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. That's wrong. He's simply, under the law, the senior military advisor to the president. But the Secretary of Defense is much, much more if you go through and read Title 10. I don't know what happened. I certainly hope that whatever has happened, that Lloyd Austin recovers. And I don't think it was his intention to hide, per se. We just don't know the whole story. And, you know, again, as we've discussed in the past, are we sure that anybody else in the White House wasn't also aware? I'm sure that the National Security Advisor must have known. I'd be surprised if other members of the National Security Council staff are not also aware. So the best I can say is that I hope Lloyd Austin recovers, even though I'm hardly a fan of his. But I say that because Lloyd Austin is one of the few people who, behind the scenes, I'm told, has expressed concern about our tendency to overreach and put the American military in a difficult position, particularly in position to fight a major war. So his voice in that sense is missed, but whether or not anybody listens to him, well, that's another point entirely. And this may be evidence that they don't.
What do you attribute the bile and hatred and anger that Joe Biden seems to have towards Vladimir Putin?
I don't know.
I don't expect you to psychoanalyze him, but is this just an outdated view of the head of the Russian government? Treat them as if they're the old Soviet Union, not the modern day economic powerhouse that they've become.
Well, there was also a lot of lingering distrust and contempt for the Russians during the Balkan campaigns, first in Bosnia-Herzegovina and then later on in Kosovo. I dismissed it at the time as a hangover from the Cold War, but many of the same people have resurfaced and continue to harbor hatred for Russia, which is obviously counterproductive and stupid. But Biden is somebody who has said different things on different occasions. I attribute much of what he says to his age and his mental state, whatever that happens to be.
I sort of think, and tell me if you agree or disagree, or if I'm trying to play psychoanalyst here, his views about Russia and his views about Israel seem to be hopelessly outdated and locked in time from when he was a younger man and formulating his views. And it's almost as if nothing has happened in the past 20 years to modify them.
I would separate one from the other. I think this is a man who has courted and enjoyed support, monetary, financial support from a number of key donors. The Israel lobby is just one of those. And he has historically honored the interests of all of his donors. So I don't see the views that he's expressed about Israel as being any different from those that he's expressed in the past. Russia is the other side of the coin. And again, he may be another cold warrior who never came to terms with reality, or he may decide that it's simply convenient to take that position because it's one that his donors want him to take. You know, I'm not somebody who thinks a great deal of most politicians inside the Beltway, Judge, frankly.
Is Israel its own worst enemy?
I think so. But obviously the Israelis at this point are still emoting, still angry and determined to leverage the United States in their goal of ridding Israel of all its Arabs. That includes the West Bank as well as Gaza. Gaza is the first dramatic step, but the West Bank is not far behind. I think it's undoable or unworkable. I told my friends that. I said I see nothing good resulting for Israel from any of this. But they take the opposite position, and so do their supporters here. The great danger is that they end up in a situation from which they cannot de-escalate, because I see no evidence for de-escalation, either in Washington or in Jerusalem. Everyone is escalating. And eventually this escalation will be met by equal and opposite force. And that's the great danger, because I don't know how the Israelis survived that encounter. We can obviously float and fly away, which is what we always do when things don't go the way we would like them to. That's not the case for Israel. They live there. They have to deal with the consequences. And this war will not end when the Israelis decide to stop killing Arabs. We need to get that through our heads. The populations in the region are enraged. Don't dismiss that. Everybody does, and it's a great mistake. And the elites understand that if they do not stand up to this newest aggression in Gaza and to the Israelis, that they may not survive in office. Coups may remove them.
When you say elites, you mean the elites of the governments in the region.
Sure, I'm talking about Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Iraq. All of them understand that they could conceivably be removed unless they step forward and pivot away from Israel and pivot towards a growing alliance of peoples in the region against Israel.
What do you expect Egypt to do if the IDF shows up on the ground in Egypt under the pretext or perhaps the reality of wanting to control the border between Gaza and Egypt? Would that not be an invasion?
Well, there's a heated argument at the highest levels in Egypt about that. Many think that that's an act of war and Egypt must reject it. But Sisi is ultimately our man, and he's already viewed in Egypt by millions as an Israeli puppet and as an American puppet. The assumption in Egypt is that he will ultimately do what he's always done, back down and accommodate Israel. If he does that, I don't think he'll last in office. I think there are so many people in Egypt determined to right the wrong that they see in Gaza that they are willing to put everything at risk and go to war. And I think that's the reason why I said earlier, the elites need to think carefully about their behavior in the past. You know, we've tended to bribe as much as bully people in the region, and the populations aren't going to take it. That's the difference. The elites just want to govern. They're not too different from the people that we have. They want to retain their positions of power, influence, and their wealth. So they're going to have to make some hard choices. If they don't go along with it, if General Sisi just says, oh, well, we can't help it, we'll have to withdraw, I don't think he'll last.
How about at the other side of Israel? How dangerous is it for the Israelis to be attacking Hezbollah? Alistair Crook reports that 250,000 Israelis have been involuntarily relocated out of the West Bank to hotels in Israel at the expense of the Israeli government. That'll be an enormous expense against their will, but that's where they are until the Israeli government tells them they can go back. Obviously, something is planned, or they wouldn't be undergoing an expense and a migration of that magnitude.
Well, the number that was cited to me by sources in Israel about people that lived along the northern border where, you know, these exchanges of gunfire have occurred was 96,000. But whether it's 96,000 or a total of, say, 250,000, including those Israelis who live down near Gaza, it doesn't make any difference. It's not sustainable. Israel cannot do this for very long. There has to be some sort of resolution. Netanyahu knows this, so does his cabinet. But at the same time, they feel that they've got to do what they're doing, that this is a once, perhaps in a 50-year opportunity to build the greater Israel that they have privately always wanted. And the Israeli population is behind them to the tune of something like 85 to 90% plus. You just have to look at the polling data. So they want to stay the course, and that means you inevitably have to attack Hezbollah. Now, keep in mind, a lot of people, and I include myself in that category, think the operation in Gaza has failed. That doesn't mean it's going to stop, but it certainly did not go as well as the Israelis had hoped. And the consequence of that is there's also an interest in distracting public attention away from Gaza. And how do you do that? Well, you attack Hezbollah. But there are plenty of people in the Israeli armed forces who understand that that's a fight to the finish, and that will require virtually all of Israel's resources, unless, of course, we come in and support the Israeli Defense Force against Hezbollah. If we do that, it will be largely from the air and offshore in terms of missiles and airstrikes. But of course, that's also risky for us because we'll probably lose some aircraft. We may even lose some naval craft. It's hard to tell. It depends on the proximity to Hezbollah. So if that happens, we don't know how the American public is going to respond. Some will say, fine, great, do it. But a lot of people will begin to ask hard questions. Have we thought this through? Which, of course, we haven't. What's our strategy? And, of course, we have none, other than to unconditionally support Israel. And the Israelis want to try and do things as quickly as possible because they're a citizen soldier force. They can't keep hundreds of thousands of able-bodied men in the field fighting that need to be back inside the economy working. So everything is being done without, I think, long-term strategic consequences being fully understood. But you get caught up in this sort of thing in warfare. You're dragged along. The dynamic of conflict just takes you on a ride, and it becomes very difficult to get off. And I think that's where Israel is right now. There really is no off-ramp.
Do you suspect that Prime Minister Netanyahu and his cabinet, including the extreme right-wingers in the cabinet, whose departure from the government apparently Prime Minister Netanyahu fears, understand that Israel cannot defeat Hezbollah on its own?
I don't know. That's the conventional wisdom, certainly in military circles in Washington, that a two-front war is too much for the IDF. On the other hand, if you restrict the numbers of forces around Gaza to only those you need to contain Gaza, you continue to apply pressure from the air, relentlessly bombing the population and the structures, then I suppose you can make the argument that enough of the IDF can be committed to Hezbollah that it's possible to make it work. Again, I still think it depends heavily on us. I don't think they will attack Hezbollah unless they're about 90% certain that we will back them up, because that's the only way that it can be done successfully, at least in their judgment. Now, there is a lot more happening in Lebanon and Syria than we report here. There are more capabilities up there. There are air defense systems that belong to the Russians and Russian air defense systems that are being provided to others in the region, like the Syrians and the Lebanese. These are not irrelevant. They could down aircraft. They can have a profound impact. And of course, as we've discussed many, many times, Hezbollah has infinitely more rockets and missiles at its disposal, as well as far larger numbers of experienced combat fighters based on the experience of the Syrian civil war than Hamas had. Hamas has done pretty well. Hezbollah can do a lot better. I think the Israelis know that. So again, I think this turns on our willingness to support it actively with our own air power and offshore naval power.
What is the U.S. goal, if you can discern one, in bombing selected targets in Yemen? I mean, Yemen is a member of the United Nations, so this attack theoretically is illegal. But what does the Biden administration believe they're accomplishing by this? And what did they, if anything, accomplish?
Well, let's do a little backward analysis. What has actually happened as a result of our strikes? The first thing is that we essentially declared the region in that part of the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean a war zone. Well, as soon as we did that, all of the major insurance corporations in the world who normally insure commercial shipping at sea will no longer insure any vessels that move through that area of the world. So we've effectively shut down commercial shipping. Now, I'm told that today a commercial vessel was attacked. I don't know the details. I don't know whether or not there was any serious damage done. But that would also indicate that whatever we did to the Houthis hasn't deterred them in any way, shape, or form. And I think we may have discussed it previously. The Houthis are pretty tough. I mean, they went through years of warfare against the Saudis. We and the Saudis bombed the living daylights out of them, and they were fighting against Al-Qaeda as well as Saudi forces. The two were cooperating against them because they were Shiites. These people are not going to roll over and play dead for us. So I think they're going to be a permanent thorn in our side, and they're going to continue to disrupt traffic through the Gate of Tears into the Red Sea.
Can the United States Navy sustain a prolonged battle in the Red Sea?
That's all dependent upon how much money you want to spend and how you're going to support them logistically. Diego Garcia is there, but that's quite a distance from the region we're talking about. And then you have Djibouti. You have to look at the naval installations that are available where you could reload ammunition, particularly missiles, where you can get support if you need new engines, new propulsion, whatever it turns out to be. You know, I don't know the answers to those questions. I rather suspect it's pretty tough. If we've had trouble, and I know we have, sustaining a combat or a carrier battle group in the Eastern Mediterranean, I would think we'd have even more trouble sustaining a permanent naval presence off the coast of Yemen, in the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea.
What would happen, in your view, if Joe Biden listened to Lindsey Graham? I suppose we could stop right there and say catastrophe without me even suggesting what the senator has offered, and attacked Iran.
Well, you know, the problem with President Biden is that he sets out certain red lines. He makes statements, and over time, he evolves beyond those statements. What I'm talking about is the statements he made early on during the Ukraine proxy war, that he was going to not send specific types of equipment or technologies to Ukraine because that would result potentially in World War III. He talked specifically about cruise missiles. Initially, that statement was made about rocket artillery. He wasn't going to send any U.S. forces on the ground into Ukraine, but we know we've had something in the vicinity of 400 to 500 men killed on the ground in Ukraine. Now, they may not have been wearing U.S. uniform, but they were there and they were killed. Maybe they were contractors or temporarily assigned as contractors. So he's backed off several times and done what he said he would never do. My concern right now is the same thing could happen with Iran. He allegedly sent some message to Iran about the Houthis, which I found laughable. There doesn't seem to be any understanding that the Houthis are not Iranians. They're Arabs. And just like the Arab militias in Iraq, they are committed to fight alongside Hamas and the Palestinians in Gaza and on the West Bank. And they are trying to do as much damage as they can against us in the hopes that we will leverage our power to push the Israelis back and away from Gaza. Well, we're not going to do that. So I think that's something everybody misses. It wouldn't matter whether the principal Ayatollah in Tehran told these militias, do nothing, stop. They're Arabs, and we can't lose sight of that identity.
I'm going to play a clip for you. This is number 5, Chris, of Admiral Kirby discussing just what you and I are discussing. And I'd like your opinion as to whether or not Admiral Kirby's words manifest an understanding, a realistic understanding of what's going on in that part of the world. This is Admiral Kirby on Face the Nation yesterday.
Does the U.S. assess that these coalition strikes will deter the Houthis, or are you bracing for retaliation and an open-ended conflict?
I think it'd be Pollyannish for us to think that there couldn't or may not be some sort of retaliatory strike by the Houthis. We're watching this very, very closely. We've taken the requisite necessary precautions in the region to make sure we're ready for that if that should occur. These strikes were meant to disrupt and degrade their ability to conduct these strikes. And so we think that we had good effect on that. We're still assessing the battle damage assessment of those strikes, but we think we had good effect. We'll see what happens. The Houthis have a choice to make here now, Margaret. And the right choice is to stop these reckless attacks. And no matter what they say, this is not about punishing Israel. I mean, one of the ships they took a shot at yesterday was Panamanian flagged, and it was taking Russian oil. It had nothing to do with Israel.
So it may be an open-ended conflict. We don't know if deterrence has been established.
Nobody wants a conflict with the Houthis. We're not looking for a conflict with Yemen here. We're trying to get these attacks to stop.
If we have sufficiently degraded the Houthis, or like the Ukrainians attacking a Russian ship that's already in dry dock?
Battle damage assessment is an art, not a science. People look at what airstrikes or missile strikes have achieved on the ground. They often reach different conclusions. Admittedly, a lot of battle damage assessment involves wishful thinking. Remember, the air forces, not just the naval forces, but the air forces are very, very sensitive to what comes back as battle damage assessment. If the Air Force is part of it, then the operation has to be successful. I'm sure Naval Air feels as similar feelings. So I don't place a great deal of stock in battle damage assessment. My point is that I don't think they were very effective. If they were, I don't think the Houthis would have already launched strikes against another commercial vessel. And I think they'll launch strikes against our naval vessels if they think they can do damage. Now, fortunately, they're using old technology, but it's still problematic enough that it's caused enormous trouble for the world's commerce. And that's the principal concern. This sort of thing disrupts supply chains. It stops access to critical minerals and resources. It's bad news. You know, why didn't someone talk to the Houthis? Whatever you may think of them, whatever you don't like about them, why didn't we talk to them? We don't do that. We are not interested in talking. We want to bully people into submission. I don't think that's going to work with the Houthis.
Do you have any idea why Senator Graham and his colleagues want us to attack Iran? I mean, there isn't even an argument to be made for that, and the risks are potentially catastrophic for Israel, are they not?
I think so. I think they could be catastrophic for us as well. Perhaps not as quickly, but eventually. You know, there's a lot of emoting. And remember, these people are all owned by someone else with lots of money. They don't take up a cause without being boosted in the effort with lots of cash, because they're ultimately interested in staying in office. None of the people on the Hill are responsible or accountable for very much of anything. So whatever they say, however damaging or dangerous, they get away with it. It's a little more serious in the White House, where ultimately the president, as the chief executive, is responsible for what goes on. So if we go to war with Iran, if we actually push the envelope, and I think for Graham and those that support him, bombing the Houthis in their minds is a way to eventually embroil Iran. I think attacking Hezbollah is another way to eventually embroil Iran. All of these people, I run into people all the time that, you know, they're convinced that Iran is the source of all evil everywhere. They've been drinking this Kool-Aid for years and years and years. They don't understand what they're dealing with. So let's say they bomb Iran. We know that Russia will not stand by and allow Iran to be pulverized. Iran has better air defenses now than it's ever had in its history. Those will certainly obstruct some of the airstrikes. At the same time, they're stronger militarily. They have an arsenal that involves thousands of missiles with the range to rain terrible destruction on Israel. They also, we think, have access to some of the newer Soviet hypersonic missiles. Those could be used against our ships at sea. So it's a dangerous proposition. You know, we are accustomed, Judge, to dealing with opponents in the Middle East and elsewhere in the world who are, I would say, cooperative targets. They don't have any air defense. They don't really have armies. They don't really have air forces. So you can pretty much do whatever you want. It's analogous to the Italian invasion of Ethiopia or the Italian invasion of Libya. Those days are over. That era has ended. We're now beginning to bump up against genuine military capability. And that military capability should not be underestimated. And we may well be surprised by how good it is. And keep in mind that the Russians, as I said earlier, are not going to allow this to go on for very long. Neither will the Chinese. Remember, the Chinese desperately want access to the oil and gas that comes out of the Middle East. They also need access to the food from East Africa. So their commercial interests are titanic. That's why they sent 6 ships over to the Indian Ocean, not because they're threatening anybody. They want to make sure the vessels get through, so they go through the straits and up to China. And the Chinese aren't alone. There are others who are equally interested in this.
Showing you demonstrations in Washington and in London over this past weekend. Do you have this one's obviously Washington. It's about 200,000 people there, according to the organizers. I realize these numbers are always debatable. Do you have a feel for the gravity of Israel's loss of the PR war with respect to its behavior in Gaza? And add to all of this, there's a view for you. Add to all of this the strength of the arguments made by the South African lawyers as compared to the tepid defense made by the Israeli lawyers at the International Criminal Court of Justice. My question is, can you put your finger on the pulse of public opinion, and do you see that dial moving against Israel?
First, I don't think anybody in the United States, I shouldn't say anybody, but the vast majority of Americans could care less what the International Court of Justice says. We don't care. We haven't signed on for it as a nation, and Americans are just not interested. And as you point out, it doesn't get much coverage anyway. So I don't see that makes any difference at all. The Israelis could nuke Gaza tomorrow morning, and I don't think a lot of Americans would understand what that means. It probably wouldn't be reported accurately or quickly through the U.S. media. So for the moment, no, I don't think that makes any difference. Now, you're pointing to something else. This has a lot to do with our social cohesion. These kinds of demonstrations would not have happened in 1990 or 91 when we intervened and in the Gulf War and went into Kuwait and ultimately Iraq. They wouldn't have happened because those people were really not here. All of this immigration has occurred since then. Not all of it, but a great deal of it. We don't have much social cohesion anymore. The average American is exactly what I described. So I'm not going to get very upset about this. I mean, even before World War I, when almost a third of the American electorate was either descended from or emigrated from Germany into the United States, we had some demonstrations, but nothing on this scale. And the Germans who were here, either the ones born in the United States or had emigrated, ultimately signed on and joined the United States Army and went to war. I know because I met several of them when I was a young man. So we have a different country today. And you've got to ask yourself, if these people are this exercised over what's happening in Gaza, what does that mean for the United States as a population? Now, in some ways, this could be good because it may constrain our action in the future and reduce our ability to involve ourselves in people's internal affairs around the world, which would be a good thing. On the other hand, what does this say if we get into a real conflict and we expect to pull the nation together and fight somebody, and we have vast numbers of people like this take to the streets and say no? It's a double-edged sword. So this is a big issue. It goes beyond the Israeli-Arab conflict.
It's a huge issue. You and I have discussed it many times and will again. Before we go, I want to show you a clip. It's from the second argument. So there were four lawyers on each side, four South African lawyers, four lawyers, well, they weren't South African, four lawyers representing South Africa, four lawyers representing Israel. The second one for South Africa, embedded into his argument, Israeli soldiers dancing and chanting and making reference to Amalek in the Old Testament on the rubble that they had just caused in Gaza. I thought this was reprehensible, but I'd like your view of it. Here.
On 7 December 2023, Israeli soldiers proved that they understood the Prime Minister's message to remember what the Amalek has done to you as genocider. They were recorded by journalists dancing and singing. We know our motto, there are no uninvolved, that they obey one commandment, to wipe off the seed of Amalek. The Prime Minister's invocation of Amalek is being used by soldiers to justify the killing of civilians, including children. These are the soldiers repeating the inciting words of their Prime Minister.
I'm coming to occupy Gaza and beat Hezbollah. I take that one mitzvah to wipe off the seed of Amalek. Do American soldiers do that?
I haven't seen that level of hatred and contempt for the enemies that we fought. I'm sure some people feel that way. I know that during Gulf War I, as Americans became more exposed to the Arabs that they saw in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iraq, what they saw did not endear the Arabs to them. But that kind of blatant hatred, no. But keep something in mind. The hatred and contempt for Arabs in Israel is not a new development. That's been existent for many, many years. Secondly, the Arabs, that actually those that live in Israel in many cases, feel exactly the same contempt and hatred for the Jews. Now, I'm not defending any of it. I'm simply pointing out that what Mr. Netanyahu has done is tap into it. Now, this tapping into it is dangerous, as you point out, because suddenly the rains go away. On an incident at the end of the fighting in which I was involved in 91, I decided to call for a ceasefire. We'd been halted for several hours, and it had reached a point where we were sort of annihilating anything we could reach that was in front of us, and there wasn't much left to shoot at. We'd largely run out of targets. Almost everything was destroyed, and when opposing Iraqi soldiers stuck their heads up, we could see it on the thermal sights, and we'd start dropping mortar rounds on them to bring them out so they could be machine gunned. I looked at this and I said, that's it. It's got to stop. So I got off the tank and I directed the PSYOPs team to announce a ceasefire. And then I got a hold of commanders and I said, look, you've got to stop firing. We didn't come here to exterminate the Iraqi enemy. We came here to win a fight. We've won it. So we stopped. But there were some soldiers and there were some officers who didn't like that, who got very angry and said, no, we're killing them. Let's finish it. I said, we didn't come here to annihilate all these people. We came here to win a fight. We've won the fight. There's no reason to continue killing these people. They have nowhere to go, no escape. So I think I was surprised out of some 3,000 or 4,000 people engaged, perhaps 500, 550 survived and came over, and we treated their wounds and dressed them. And I was impressed with the compassion and humanity that most of the American soldiers showed to these wounded Arabs. But Israel's in a different situation. There is a long history of this. And this is very dangerous because the Arabs are acutely sensitive to it. I mean, you can't stand there and say these things and then be surprised that Arabs, Turks, and Iranians, all Muslims, decide that they hate you. You can't make those statements, that they are animals, effectively. That's what you've told the region. This is once set in motion. This is very, very hard to stop and contain.
Colonel Macgregor, you're a great man. Thank you very much for your time, for your analysis.
Judge, can I add one point here?
Of course.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something that doesn't seem to get a great deal of attention. It was reported recently, and it's in the open press, that the Iranians have begun enriching uranium to weapons-grade plutonium. For your audience, this means that it's enriched to 20% or more, and the plutonium then is capable of being utilized in making bombs for warheads on missiles or dropping from airplanes or whatever. This is not an accident. The Iranians have restrained themselves in the past. They've kept well below those levels. They're now actively making that plutonium. I have very, very little doubt in my mind that they can transform that plutonium into nuclear weapons. At the same time, the Turks know, and have known this for a long time, that if they were ever in the position where they felt they were going to be directly threatened by another nation with a nuclear weapon, and in the Middle East, everybody assumes that's Israel, that Pakistan would provide nuclear warheads that could be utilized by the Turks. These developments are huge and get no attention. People need to understand what this means. It means that if this war spreads, as I think it will, I think we're on the slippery slide into a major regional war. The Houthis, Hezbollah, the militias are symptomatic of where I think we're headed. I think that Washington wants desperately war with Iran. And I think there are enough people who are careless and don't really understand the region, don't understand the facts, are beating the drums for it. And all of these things point to a disaster that we really don't want to confront. But no one in the White House is addressing this. No one is standing up in front of the American people and saying, look, this is very serious. This is beyond the usual Arab-Israeli conflict. This is not something that lasts for a few weeks and then ends and results in some sort of treaty or a new agreement or a change in the border. This has become a war for the existence of Israel on the one hand, and a war for the existence of the Arabs and Muslims in the region on the other. This is not exclusively Mr. Netanyahu's problem. Mr. Netanyahu said this is existential. Either we win or we're finished. Well, that dangerous attitude has been adopted by the people that surround him. And I don't think we can bribe them to stop. I don't think we can bully them into stopping. And I think if we become involved, we put a lot of things at risk, ourselves, our installations. Remember, you have a total, I think, of roughly 57,000 American servicemen in the region. You have between Syria, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, probably almost 30,000. The other 20,000 are distributed in those other areas in Jordan and elsewhere. They will be at serious risk. And we cannot protect everyone everywhere all of the time, particularly when we're trying to protect Israel. So there has to be some more thorough analysis and thinking about the implications of our actions and the actions of our Israeli friends. And I'm just not seeing it. What I see is more emotion and very little rational calculus.
Because you see a president on the cusp of a re-election, which he thinks will not succeed unless he can be a wartime president. If I could be so bold as to attempt to finish your thought.
Well, you and I know that did not turn out to be the case for Lyndon Johnson.
Right.
I don't think it was the case for Harry Truman. FDR died while he was in office. Had he lived longer and the outcome of the war being fully explained to the American people, I think he'd been in a lot of trouble. That's water under the bridge. I think the opposite is true. I think the left and Joe Biden know that Joe Biden is not going to run again. And if he does, he's not going to win. So I think they are similar in some respects to Mr. Netanyahu. They want to leverage their control and dominance politically, militarily, economically over us and the rest of the world to reshape the region to their satisfaction. They failed miserably in Ukraine. They're going to make noises. We're sending small numbers of troops to northern Finland and northern Sweden. We're stoking the fires of fear in Scandinavia and Germany by telling everyone war with Russia is coming, which is only if we attack Russia, and no one there wants to do that. It's all nonsense. But I see the same sort of mentality driving us down this sort of one-way street to disaster into a fight that we can avoid and don't need to fight. And I don't think Israel needs to demand that all of its unwelcome opponents in the region have to be destroyed in order to create this new greater Israel. I think the opposite is the probability, and that is it doesn't work, and Israel's at very severe risk of being destroyed.
Hàng thứ 12, đầu tiên móc một đơn một giảm. Móc 6 đơn một giảm. Móc 2 đơn một giảm. Sáu đơn một giảm một đơn. Hàng 13 móc 20 một đơn. Hàng 15 mốc 24 mỗi đơn. Hàng 16 mốc 2 đơn, mốc 2 tăng 10 đơn 2 lần. Hàng 17 đến hàng 21, mỗi hàng mốc 28 mỗi đơn.